To enable audio control, please enter your audio PIN followed by the pound or hash sign. If you do not have a PIN,
that Julie?
just press pound or hash.
Julie, we can hear you.
All right. So I wasn't sure if this wasn't working. So am I good?
Yep, you're good. We can hear you.
Well, not that good, you.
You're good to go. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to call the Board of Selectmen's meeting for January 26, 2022 to order. This is a workshop of the Board of Selectmen. We are joined with our police chief, all 5 members of the board. One is online, Julie Kavanaugh is online. Our attorney from KP Law, Jeff Blake. One resident in the room, several people online. Town administrator, our license guru, Danielle. And we're having a workshop today for the Board of Selectmen on its liquor license and entertainment regulations. And we've asked our attorney here today so that we can have an open conversation about these regulations with everything that's been going on. This is not a public meeting, so the public will not be speaking today. This is a Board of Selectmen workshop. If there's any suggestions on changes to the liquor regulations, we will bring them before a public meeting so that anyone that's interested can comment on it. So for today's exercise, this is for the board, the attorney, the police chief, not the public. With that, Joe, I will open this up, maybe an opening statement from you, if you'd like, and then we'll call Jeff Blake, our attorney, up to the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and to the members of the board and everybody assembled. And thanks for the opportunity to provide some context about what can transpire today. As the board recalls, there are a number of liquor license violation hearings that occurred in 2021. And as a result of that process, but also the board's debrief process, you all determined that it would be beneficial to meet in 2022, as we are today, to discuss generally the town's liquor license regulations as it relates to our Board of Selectmen as the local licensing authority. So this is a workshop that we've contemplated for a few weeks now, and I'm thrilled that we're able to take it underway. And I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, the way that you've set that up this morning, because we are fortunate to have Attorney Jeff Blake, who is of counsel at KP Law and specifically advises the board as the local licensing authority. And it's also beneficial for me, and I know for Danielle Delaney, our executive assistant for all matters licensing, to hear the discussion today at your workshop. So thank you for that. And with that, I turn it right back to you, sir.
Thank you, Joe. Jeff, if you would, join us at the table.
I'd be happy to.
So as Joe mentioned, we have contemplated this for some time. The police department, Chief Gilmet, had read quite a memo to us with the amount of incidences that took place in town this year. We have a very lengthy liquor regulation. I know Selectman Anderson had some questions as it related to entertainment licenses on there and what the hearings were and how they were noticed. But what we're really trying to do is to get rid of any gray area and give the chief some teeth, I guess, so that we're not having his department do all of this work and then having hearings and having no violations. So, Jeff, if you would start with an overview of what our regulations are.
Sure.
And then we can get into questions from the board.
I mean, I think you have I've viewed many liquor license regulations through various communities. You guys have a very comprehensive set of liquor license regulations. You've gone down through, you've required the rules and regulations to be posted. It's a violation of these liquor license regulations if you don't have them as an establishment. You've gone through and had a very detailed filing process and outlined what the responsibilities of the applicant are, which I think is wonderful. Oftentimes, we don't see that, and it's kind of a situation where that's been the past practice. Here, you actually have it in writing. How you've outlined how you get admitted to the premises, who can be admitted, when they can be admitted, hours of operation, description of the physical premises, various business arrangements with the licensees, which I don't see very often necessarily in a liquor license regulation. There are ABCC requirements, but you guys have gone through and you've spelled it out, again, very detailed. We've come down through and I'm looking at page 11, and I think this is where we start to get into what's going on here. You know, you've done your physical premises, you know, business arrangement licenses, and then we go on to, at page 11, we start talking about entertainment at the premises. And in there, you have outlined what needs to be done with respect to licensing on the, for a licensed premise under 138. If they're gonna do entertainment, they're required to do a chapter 140, section 130, 183A license. You've gone through, and in there, you've also outlined and somewhat incorporated some of the standards that we find in other chapter in your bylaws, and that is with respect to the inside entertainment noise levels and outside entertainment noise levels, and the need for the various other licenses that may be required. You go on to talk about maintaining of front doors, and I really kind of like this one because your liquor license almost import from the entertainment license statute 140 section 183A certain requirements, and that is to diligently dispense of loitering and patrons, and talk about maintaining a front door in a closed position, asking loiterers to disperse, promptly notifying the police if loiterers fail to disperse, hiring security guards and the like. You guys are very comprehensive in that, and I think that that was helpful to us in some of the liquor license hearings that we had, and we were able to point to these sections as to whether or not they were doing a sufficient enough job of doing that. But I think you've outlined it nicely in your regs. You have your inspections. One of the issues that we have here in speaking with your town administrator, while you do have in a section, and this is on page 13, and the section is 1.11, that talks about inspections and investigations. You don't appear to have somebody who does a annual or monthly or seasonal actual inspection of the premises for purposes of liquor license compliance. I think what has happened, at least in my experience with you folks, is that, you know, unfortunately, it's the chief who ultimately ends up becoming the liquor license inspector, and that is on a reactatory basis, if that's a word. I don't think it is, but having to react to complaints and then coming in. You may, in your license here, it does say that the liquor licensing authority and its duly authorized agents shall be allowed to inspect licensed premises. So you may consider possibly delegating that duty to somebody in town who would go through and check for things, for example, whether or not there's a copy of the liquor license regulations, whether or not some of the premises requirements are in place, whether or not there's a doorman or a door person, whether or not these establishments have X, Y, and Z and policies and procedures that are required under your regulation in effect. We don't really have that now, I don't believe. I think in speaking with the town administrator, he had indicated that we don't have that. And that might be something that could help preclude some of the issues that we've been seeing and that we saw last summer. So you do have the inspections and investigations, and again, you have standards of conduct at the premises, a requirement to monitor and prevent illegal activity on the licensed premises. While I think a lot of these things are things that are self-evident, but at least you have it here, and there's no argument that you can't have X, Y, Z on the premises. And then you go through and you have your revocation, suspension, and modification procedure, the hearing procedure, and, you know, the disciplinary guidelines, which every regulation should have. When we go to the, it used to be I was always mistaking the appellate tax board for the ABCC for the appellate tax board, because I was doing so much, and I almost just said appellate tax board. But when you go to the ABCC, that's one of the first things that they're gonna wanna look at when we issue some type of discipline, whether or not we actually have guidelines and whether or not we follow those guidelines. And you have them here. And then, of course, you have how to serve the suspension orders and permission to close premises, which goes to a so-called pocket license. Some licensees in towns that are full of their quotas, they may not be open anymore, but they keep this license because they think it has value. In your regulations, you put that in. It's nice to, when we go before the ABCC for a pocket license type of suspension, that you have this in here, and that means that everybody is on notice that this is how these things are gonna go. The ABCC often takes the position that you have to notify the people that they have to get their license in order, and then you've gotta give them at least 6 months to go forward. I think that you have limited that a little bit, and I think that it's a very good section here, and it would help with the so-called pocket license. And then, of course, you have your 1.21 section on management, the responsibilities. Again, I frankly think that those are self-evident, but it's in here, it's pretty comprehensive, and it's a good reminder to them, just so that later on in a situation, they can't say, well, we didn't know we were supposed to comply with X, Y, and Z. And then, of course, your service training. Again, the ABCC has various requirements here, but you have in fact put this into writing. And I think that again, it's a very comprehensive regulation, and I think that, if we look at it and we interpret it reasonably as we must, I don't know other than the liquor license inspector, if there's a lot that would need to be amended here. Now, of course, I don't sit through this all day, every day. I don't get all the emails that you guys get with respect to the regulations, the questions, the comments, and I'm sure that you have cross-engine comments. So I say that from a legal point of view, do I see anything in here that's wrong that is a particularly gray area? I don't know that I do. However, certainly in speaking with you today, hopefully you can identify what you may think is gray areas, and I can take a crack at with your town administrator, clarifying those if you want. And we can make this a lot more, or we can make this more clear, I guess, is what I would say, to the extent that there are any ambiguities.
Thank you, Jeff. I think we'll tackle this one at a time, but I guess I'm gonna put the police chief on the spot. So maybe you would like to join us at the front table, if you would, chief. The inspector. Now, we do a very proactive, at the beginning of the year, meeting where the police chief speaks. ABCC generally shows up at that meeting, town administrator's there. We invite in all of the liquor licenses, and entertainment licenses, I believe, are covered in that meeting as well. Yes. Or as a subsection. Is there anything that we're doing currently to have people initial and sign each page of these liquor license regulations, the manager of record, that shows that they got them, they understand them, they've read them, and they're gonna adhere to them? Do we require that on any level?
We have a sign-in process at the meeting. The meeting, first of all, is voluntary. I know some communities make it mandatory under their liquor regulations, so that's something that could be considered.
So right now, there is no, other than the sign-in for that meeting, which is voluntary, not mandatory.
Correct.
There's none of the liquor licenses are having to sign for these regulations.
Let's not lose sight of the fact that the licensees are just that. It's their obligation to read and understand that. And us going above and beyond and having them initial and sign and everything, I would defer to Attorney Blake, but it's their obligation. as a licensee.
All I'm trying to do in the end, Chief, is make it so when we go to these hearings, or we go to an ABCC hearing, that we have one more thing to say. They read it, they understood it, they signed for it.
No, I understand.
So, and only because of the problems the town of Harwich has had. Now, I would just state for the record, we have a lot of great businesses in this town, and then we've had some problems with some businesses, but for the most part, we have a very responsible group of business owners. And then some that have made some mistakes, and they're correcting those mistakes. I want to take away what we all went through and the great cost that this town went through, each and every taxpayer, by your overtime, Chief, by our attorney's bills, by our town administrator not being able to finish other jobs because he was a hearing officer. And I would like to get rid of all of any gray area that anyone would have. So would the board support having the liquor licensees sign the liquor regulations, that the manager of record read them and they understand them? And to second that, make that meeting mandatory, not voluntary. You come to the beginning of the meeting. So, Mary?
I'm not sure about the signing part. I mean, it would be one more piece of paper, but it sounds like it's their problem anyway. But I would like to make the meeting mandatory. And I don't know if we could do something, because that's the license holder, so that could be the owner, not necessarily who's there that night. Could we also require that they review this with all of their bartenders? One head bartender, frankly, had no idea we had liquor regulations, and he was their head bartender.
To answer your question, yes, I think you could. You could require the owner and the manager, and require that they provide copies or summaries, or have them speak with their head bartenders or whomever about the regulations. Whether or not you would want them to come to the mandatory meeting, I don't know if that becomes a numbers game. You know, if you're gonna get an owner, certainly a manager should be required to come to that meeting. But if we're gonna start talking about head bartenders and other employees, you might be able to, I mean, you couldn't hold it in this room.
Yeah.
So, you know, certainly the manager is responsible for what's going on. The owner is responsible, and the manager is responsible. So certainly you could make that mandatory for those two individuals.
And by mandatory, can that be dependent on whether or not we renew the license?
We could make it part of, we could amend the regulation to require it, and in order to get your license and keep your license, you have to comply with the regulations. So your failure to comply, because I think and I might be wrong, I think the timing of it is you renew these licenses, then you have the meeting. So
Okay.
it's not like you would have the meeting on December 15th, renew the or maybe you do. December 15th, renew the licenses on the 31st. So you could say, listen, if you don't come to this meeting, we're not renewing your license. We could hold your license up for it. The license already been issued, so at that point, you would have to do a suspension. And in order to suspend a license, you have to give them notice and an opportunity to be heard. They could come in and they could plead their case. You know, frankly, I think what they would end up doing is once you notified them that, hey, look, we might suspend your license because you haven't complied with the regulations, which requires you to come to our meeting, they probably set something up with the chief, and the chief would hold hold some type of meeting with them to go over the liquor license regulations. The hope is that we don't have that, but for some reason, you know, who knows? Something could happen on the date that the chief's holding the meeting. You know, birth in the family, a death in the family, you know, all kinds of stuff. But you could do a suspension. You could do a revocation/suspension hearing because of their failure to comply with the reg, if we put it in the regs.
The last thing I want to do is create more work for the chief, so I got to rethink that one.
Well, and I would say that it should be a must. So we have to figure out the timing on when that meeting would be. But I would wholeheartedly agree that it shouldn't be an option with the problems that we've had to have this meeting. It should be a mandatory. And I do believe that we should have the extra piece of paper and they should sign for it, that they understand it. Don, the topic right now is whether or not we make our annual meeting mandatory or voluntary as it is right now. So I'm gonna go to you on that one. Comments, Don, on that?
I think it should be mandatory.
Larry?
I agree it should be mandatory. I think the discussion is the timing. Because it makes no sense to me to do it after we give the license and have to go through the suspension process, which could basically give them the season because we hate to knock them out. But I think the timing we have sometimes is based on the fact that we're a seasonality business, and so when they come, so we need to work that out. And the other thing I don't understand, Joe, is, or Jeff, help me on the understanding that we have to, the state gives us a certain time they have to renew the licenses. Are we tied into that as well?
Yes, the state, the all alcohol licenses, non-seasonal, are December 31st they go from January 1 to December 31st, and we renew, as you know, in December, we renew them.
So is there anything prevents us from having mandatory training, if you call it that, in December before we issue the license?
No, I can't think of an impediment to that.
And I agree, for the managers and for the owners. I'm on board on that.
Okay. Julie?
Yeah, so I would agree. I think it should be mandatory. And I also think that, to the chief's point, that yes, people sign in, maybe what we could do, and maybe Danielle being, our guru on licensing, she could attend that meeting, make sure everyone signs in, and we have an acknowledgement form that they've received. When they're signing, they're also acknowledging that they've received the regulations. And I think the timing, to Larry's point as well, is, rather than have to go through a suspension process, is to make sure we get it done so that we're ahead of the game. But I also would follow up with the service training section. And, goes back to the original question on what type of checks we're doing on a quarterly, seasonal, weekly, whatever way you want to say we're going to check these, is that we should also be telling them, and I know it's part of their alcohol license, it notes that the training is part of, the authority. So I'm assuming back to the ABCC, but we should be checking that when we go to do these inspections, and if they're seasonal or however we're doing them, to make sure that they are conducting these trainings, and that we can see that people have signed off that they have that training and it's in their files.
Thank you, Julie. Joe?
Thank you. I think this is a helpful discussion. I just want to offer up some definitions to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. And working backward from the points I wanted to make, to Selectman Ballantyne's point about the seasonality, I want to put out there that the effort that Chief Gilmet and the police department have been the lead on was intended to bring everybody together ahead of the most important, so let me strike that, not the most important, but the season that brings the most activity. And so we, as a town, can absolutely do more than we have in the past, insofar as gearing it towards seasonal versus annual. And so annual could occur sometime in December. Seasonal could occur, or should occur sometime, I think if we're going to be consistent, before April 1st, when that licensure starts. But I think to what the chief and I and other inspectors would want to get is just a reminder to everybody before Memorial Day about what is expected of them. So we can develop something that relates to the renewal or issuance process sometime in December and sometime prior to April 1st. And then perhaps rely upon a reminder session in the spring. To me, there should be further discussion on that. The other point I want to make that goes back to Selectman Anderson's comments and questions is, when we talk about manager, and I'm looking to council because I would look to you to either validate or probably invalidate what I'm about to say, but my past understanding is that there's essentially two types of managers. There's the manager that we understand who is on duty at any given time at the establishment, and I've always understood that to be the manager on duty. And I think what we're really talking about when you get to ownership, literally and figuratively, of the license, that would be the owner of record. And the owner of record is the person that's identified when the establishment applies for their license in the first place. And to me, that's the person who becomes central to all of this. So whether it's a head bartender, manager on duty, waitstaff, or anybody else, to me, ABCC and local licensing authorities should always prevail upon the owner of record to be the primary person that has to acknowledge, yes, on behalf of the establishment, we've received these regulations, we understand them, and tie back to them. So I think that makes it more direct for the chief and I and anyone else to have conversations with. We're going to the manager of record, because I think, if I'm correct, Attorney Blake, that is the person that the ABCC would also want to hear from
I was just gonna say
during
that.
the appeal process.
Well, that's the paperwork that needs to be submitted to the ABCC. When they change the manager, they have to submit the paperwork. So that's, when we talked about owner, I agree with you, it should be the owner of a record and the manager. And sometimes they are the same, sometimes they are different. The owner may have zero day-to-day control, but the manager has all of that day-to-day control. That's the purpose behind having a manager of record on our files and at the ABCC. So I think it was a good idea, whoever suggested, and I actually think it was Select Person Anderson who suggested that there ought to be not only the owner, but also a manager.
If I could, the regulation piece of this could be as simple as another box on our application. I've received a copy of the regulations, I've read them, and I understand them. I mean, I think that could be as easy as that. Go ahead, ma'am.
And one more thing I'd add to that, when Julie talked about the sign-in sheet that acknowledges I've received, could we throw something either there or on the application? I commit to training all managers and bartenders, providing a copy and training, so there's no question. We won't have a head bartender didn't know what the regulations were. Is that doable?
Jeff?
It's doable. I'm just jotting this down right now, and in my mind, I'm trying to think of, something to the effect that in your regulation, it says that, you're gonna have these, you're gonna attend the meeting, you're going to have to, verify that you received the regulations, and then the next paragraph sentence could be, and owner and manager shall ensure that all employees are familiar with these regulations. So that it's just not the head bartender, right? Because the guy at the door, I mean, we had door people that were letting people in or letting people out or keeping doors open, that kind of stuff. We had employees on one establishment after hours, sitting down after working very hard that whole night. I don't, kind of don't blame them, sitting down and having a beer or something at the bar. Little did they know that that's a violation. And I think, frankly, they didn't know when we spoke with them. They had no idea. But if every single employee needed to know that, then somebody could have piped up and said, "Whoa, we can't do this. This isn't legal."
Thank you. Larry?
Yeah, that's a good point on but the failures we've had in the past, I think 100% have been lack of management, of being accountable, and so somehow we just need to strongly, I don't know how detailed we need to have it made, but the managers need to be responsible for the facility. And I think that I'm not sure we need to identify each layer they need to be responsible, but they need to be responsible for that. This always happens. I don't want to keep going on this December 31st deadline, but that's true for seasonal and for annual licenses as well?
No, this,
Annual.
just the annual. The seasonal is January 15th.
April 1. So we could, the reason I bring it up, we could still require the training, I'm calling it that,
Yeah.
before we're given the license.
Yeah, and I think.
I just wanted to clarify that.
I mean, I think that's a great point to make, because, as you guys talk, I've taken notes to try to figure out how I'm gonna amend these regulations and provide you with a draft. I think what I'm hearing is that for the all alcohol and the non-seasonal licenses, that you'd actually like to have that meeting prior to the issuance of the license. We will put in the regs, your failure to attend this hearing will result in a non-renewal of your license. So if it's for the non-seasonal licenses, which would have to be sometime in December, and I hate to do this to you, Chief, I know that December's probably busy, but for the seasonal, would we have another meeting for the seasonal folks? Because I know that, just off the top of my head, when we had a disciplinary hearing, the owner of the Perks is down in Florida. So he may not have been able to attend in December. I don't know if that's a concern of the board or what, but would we do two of them? The chief would do one in December for the non-seasonal or actually just do two. Well, do one in December for everybody, whoever can attend, and then hold another one sometime in, March or something like that. Again, prior to the issuance of the license, for the seasonal folks.
Joe?
So I think if I've heard the discussion accurately, and to Attorney Blake's questions, if the board as the LLA is looking to rely upon acknowledgement and adherence to the regulations as part of your renewal process, then I think if I could speak on behalf of Ms. Delaney, the annual licenses, they must be, the applications and materials must be submitted in the month of November. Thank you. Not before and not after. In the month of November, and so that the board takes action, as you know, in the month of December. So then, if we want to tie adherence and acknowledgement of the regulations, yes, we would make that part of the checklist in November. We could provide them, as we often do, but they're readily available, and as the chief said, it is the establishment's responsibility to have the regs and know the regs. But we could provide that as part of the renewal package in November. So then, the renewal process now relies upon an additional element. Not only that they've completed all the necessary paperwork, but that they've also received, acknowledged, and claimed knowledge of the regulations. And absence of that, if I've heard correctly, the board could rely upon their renewal process in December to have that be a potential violation that could impact upon the renewal. Is that
Yeah, I don't know,
close?
I don't know if it's, I don't know if I would characterize it as a violation, but simply a condition precedent to issuance of a renewal.
Sure, yep. And then, if I may very quickly, and then to duplicate that seasonal licensure, you have to apply in the month of February, dang it, the month of March, and approval by the board in the month of March, because the licenses go active April 1st and dissipate after January 15th. So we could handle it differently based on the type of licensure. As much as it's more work, I think it's more accurate, because we're not treating them all the same, because as the attorney said, someone for an annual license, we expect to be readily available throughout the year. Somebody with a seasonal license, we wouldn't expect them to be available until close to their license season.
Thank you, Joe. I got Larry first and then Mary.
Oh, my point's very minor. You mentioned someone in Florida. We could do these by remote as well, have a hybrid meeting, so there's. don't
I
see-
suppose,
I
yeah,
don't
if
see
that's
this- I
something
don't see
that
this-
you're interested in doing, yes.
We could make it happen.
Mary?
I'm just trying to simplify this for the chief and for Danielle and anybody else who's involved in this. What about, leave the meeting alone, it's optional, but in the package that goes out with their license, a copy of the regs and a sheet in the back that the manager of record has to sign. I have read the following and commit to educating all of my employees on this prior to January 1. Put the burden on them, not have the chief have multiple meetings and,
Mr. Chairman, if
Chief,
I
yep.
could you all look at page 20, 1.22, service training, A and B? So that requires that that an employee training program to train people on recognizing intoxicated people and identifying patrons under 21 is supposed to have a written policy, and that's supposed to be provided to the authority as part of the original renewal application. So there's, I think, some of what we're talking about already. My question is, do we get that with the renewal application? Do we get that certification from, or do they just submit the application?
Go ahead, Joe.
So I don't think it's gonna surprise anybody, but that we do not. And I think that goes to an earlier point that Attorney Blake made at the top of this workshop, is that we don't have an individual, an agent, to use the word, looking for that specifically. We can certainly rely upon our licensing, our executive assistant for licensing matters, but as we talk about, that then increases the workload. What I noticed also in Section B of that, it also says that all such documents and certifications shall be available to the licensing authority or any authorized agent upon demand. So whether we get it or not, they still have the additional obligation of having it on their premises and available upon demand.
Selectman Kavanaugh?
So that goes to my earlier point. That was what I was referencing about the training, is that it's part of what they're supposed to do and provide it. However, when we're doing seasonal checks or however we're going to go about this moving forward, to Mary's point, simplify it for the chief. I'm not trying to add more meetings or work to anybody's schedule, but if we could have, a remote meeting that all those people who are not on, around here on the Cape, and we can get that done in December, or if everybody's okay with having the 2 meetings, I'm fine with both of those. But I think we need to look at also not only making this mandatory, but going back to this training, because it's very well written and the responsibility is on the owner. But we should be checking that in terms of a seasonal check, like you're going to make sure that the license is posted and that we started off the conversation with that. We should be making sure they've got a file on that, because the other thing it talks about in C is each new employee who handles alcohol shall obtain server training within 30 days of commencing employment. Well, we might want to look at that one only because, kids get hired and they're getting hired in, say, June, July. When are you going to train them? When they're halfway through their summer of serving alcohol? I think that one needs to be looked at a little bit, because within 30, and I know that that's hard for us to monitor. And I know, again, the liability is back on the owner. But if we've got young people over 21 coming down and serving alcohol and they're not, and let's face it, summer gets crazy, how do we make sure that's happening?
Thank you, Julie. Don?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to take the opportunity to just back up and look at this from a distance for a second instead of the individual stuff. First of all, I totally agree. I'm not real interested in a gotcha moment out of this where, it says in here so-and-so, but you didn't do that and never asked. But having said that, and I'm not trying to be trite about this, ignorance of the law isn't a defense.
Agreed.
I mean, this is a privilege. Otherwise, everybody would be pouring and there would be no process. And the process says what it says. And it's the obligation of the license holder to know that. That's thought number one. Thought number two, and it used to drive me crazy with driving instructing with kids, because they would point out, well, they don't do that. They don't pull you over for this. They don't do that. And I've continuously stressed in that environment, and it's the same here. The fact that something exists that we haven't heretofore really vigorously or aggressively enforced doesn't mean that it's not enforceable. It just means that, maybe there's new sheriffs in town. They want to be able to make sure that the citizenry is safe and secure and that everybody's obligations are being upheld. Just because something hasn't happened before doesn't mean we're precluded from making it happen if it shows up in here.
In fact, there's cases that say that.
No, I know that.
Case
That's
law says
that's
that.
why I'm saying it in public, because it seems to be a shell that everybody is using, because we appear to be more aggressively enforcing things than may have happened 10 years ago, for instance. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's a regulation. And in applying for the license, you're accepting the restrictions that are outlined here, including all your agents. So I don't really care where the owner is, because I held a package seasonal license And it didn't matter who the employee was. The ultimate responsibility is the license holder, and it's their responsibility to make sure whoever it is that's going to be selling or handling, you can't have a 17-year-old picking up trays and delivering them to a table because that's not legal. All these things, I'm not interested in recapping the law. I'm interested in making sure that they know that we're going to follow the law and that regardless of who you are, this is what we're doing now.
Now, I think that with respect to this meeting, that the chief hold this meeting, as Mr. Administrator had said, to kind of remind everybody during your busy season of what's going on. And, I also think you can hand everybody the 20-page license regulations and say, make sure that and they'll sign off on it. But having a mandatory meeting where the chief goes over it again, questions get to be asked, questions get to be answered. I think that's something that really kind of drives this stuff home with them. I 100% agree with both of you when you said it's their obligation, they should have to do it, we shouldn't have to essentially hold their hand. You are right, but it does drive it home. It drives it home that, I don't know about the new sheriff in town, but that we've gotten a lot, as we all found out last summer, we've gotten a lot more complaints from abutters about noise and running of some of these establishments, and we're going to be serious. We're taking a whole new, not a whole new approach, but we are serious. We're doing this is how we're going to start enforcing, and the chief holds those meetings and just drives that home.
Before I call on Don, I think we've talked about this enough. I think there's some great suggestions. In the end, for me, it's most important to have a full packet when we go to an ABCC appeal or when we have a violation, so that it takes the gray area out. What I don't want to happen again this year is the police department to do a whole bunch of work and us to have a whole bunch of hearings with a whole bunch of non-finding of facts. And the more, I know it's their obligation, some read it, some don't. If you sign for it, it would seem to me that would have a little bit more teeth when we go to the hearing process or an appeal process. So I think we have enough suggestions on the table of what we should do. The meeting, I think we should continue the meeting the way we're doing the meeting. But like Mary, I don't want to get to a point where I couldn't make it because I had a headache, and then the chief has to have another meeting. Or I couldn't make it because I had a headache, therefore I'm appealing your suspension of my license because I didn't have the hearing. So I would leave this up to the police chief, the attorney, and administration with licensing to come up with suggestions on how we're gonna make it more ironclad.
Yep.
And then we gotta move on so this doesn't last all day. Don?
Yeah, I'm all in. I'm all in on making it a mandatory meeting and having some sort of sign off. I just wanted to clarify what I meant by the new sheriff in town. Everybody needs to understand the way the state law is structured, and we are executing this, that the Board of Selectmen is also the licensing authority, and because of that, there is always intrinsically going to be a turnover in that authority, because there are elections, and elections result in different people showing up to this. So regardless of who it is that's sitting here and how aggressively they want to pursue this, these things still say what they say.
Thank you. Mary, go ahead.
Just one clarification. I think this question is for you, Jeff. That section 122, A and B that we talked about, the way I read A is that's just talking about underage drinking. I don't read that it's the whole policy. And then B talks about the described training, which I'm assuming is A. So I think that's just about underage, and we want more than that.
I think you're right. I think A certainly is the proper procedures for verifying the patrons are 21 years of age or older, and then assigned certification.
Intoxication, though.
Yeah, not
It's also, it's also, I think, to determine whether or not these folks are intoxicated. But it's not, it certainly isn't that
The whole
I
reg.
know these
Yeah.
I've looked at these regulations, I understand that I'm bound by these regulations, and that I will provide these regulations, have a copy of these regulations, and I will make all of my
Right,
staff
right. Okay.
aware of the obligations under these regulations.
Thank you.
I'm going to bounce around for a minute because Selectman Kavanaugh has limited time. So Julie, if you want to ask questions, make comments, you might not get your answers in entirety, but we'll get them for you. But I know you only have 12 minutes left, so say what you want to say.
No, thank you. And this meeting is very helpful. And I agree with, back to what Mary just said, which is, we're talking about the training on making sure people are 21 and over. And the only thing in section B about the, certificate of training, I just want to make sure that the mandatory meeting, I think, is important, whether it's 1 or 2, whatever way it works best for administration, I'm fine with. I think that we should make sure that we're getting those, documentations, and when it talks about shall be provided to the authority as part of the original renewal application materials and maintained on the premises. I think it's important that we make sure they understand at any given time, we may come in and check that file to make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Again, no, I'm not trying to put more work on anyone, but we should notify businesses, liquor license holders, that could happen because they're supposed to have that in their being, right? I also think that any which way we can do the documentation of the mandatory training, whatever way Attorney Blake thinks it's best, that they acknowledge receipt, that they acknowledge the training of their employees. We're not trying to be more difficult. Dawn's point of these are regulations, they exist whether or not any one of us are here tomorrow is true. And they have to abide by them. And that's all we're trying to do is make sure that people are playing by the rules. They're given a liquor license, and there's a lot of responsibility that comes with it. And we just want to make sure that they're adhering to those regulations. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Julie, did you have anything else related to the entertainment licenses or liquor licenses that you see that you think needs to be addressed or at least talked about?
Yeah, I had questions on, I know it's on our liquor license about the 150 feet with the noise. I'd like to see a discussion on that. I don't know how others feel about that.
And what specifically are you questioning?
Well, we currently have a bylaw, and then we're also attaching it to the liquor license. And I think that whole 150 feet has put a lot of onus on the chief and the officers. And that may be it is a bigger discussion, but I'm wondering if that should be separated from the actual license.
Thank you. Anything else, Julie?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to the 150 foot so that we can continue the first part of this. And the first part of this, Joe, I'm going to go to you. In an earlier conversation, it was mentioned about having a person do the inspection for the LLA. We have Board of Health that does health stuff. We have building that does building stuff. Who does the inspections for the LLA? And if nobody does it, who should do it? Go ahead.
Not the reason why I wanted to raise my hand in any way, shape, or form, because I do have a response to the noise bylaw vis-a-vis 109 of the regulations. I don't have a ready answer for that because, as our chief has said, he has sworn officers that are prepared to uphold the laws. To me, a liquor regulation inspector is something different. To me, it borders on an administrative function, and that's a small a. I'm not suggesting that would be capital A administration, either me or Danielle. So I don't have an answer today. I just know that it's a critical component that we haven't captured directly. And I think, hearing what I've heard the board say, we all agree that these licenses are a privilege, and that's evidenced by the fact that the town has the ability to revoke. And so I don't know how to answer it yet. And the part of my conflict is I have a background in this, but I think if you have administration do that, then that changes the way you do hearings. And I would look to Attorney Blake if that's correct. Meaning, if you have administration, so through Ms. Delaney, you have administration working on the license application process. And then if you rely upon the administration for compliance with regulations, my gut tells me that that impacts upon having either one of those parties be part of a disciplinary action.
I'll just throw it out there, I think the police chief should do it. And I say that because, and maybe not the police chief, but maybe a designee. But I think there's a lot to having a badge walk through a door. And the liquor license regulations, we're asking the chief to uphold our regulations and to enforce our regulations, to a detriment to his staff this year with the amount of time that they had to do it. And I think the more the police chief, deputy police chief, lieutenants, whomever is assigned to walk into that business whenever they want and say, where's your liquor license? Where's your liquor license regulations? And to have that be part of his folder, to me, has a lot more teeth than anyone else we could assign it to. So, Chief, we've talked a bit lately about staff being understaffed. Is that something that you and your office could do if the board wants you to do it?
Yes, it actually exists right now. I mean, all of our officers are sworn in as agents of the local licensing authority. That's one of the things that Anita goes through when they're sworn in. It's on the paper. So, just while you're saying that, I mean, I'm thinking it would probably be more efficient to have an assigned group that were identified and more highly trained than scattered all throughout patrol. But with that being said, they're still out there responding to complaints as well. So it could be any patrol officer at any given time is going to respond to a complaint. But what you're talking about is the compliance checks, right? Are you in compliance with your premises and the regulations? So the models I know exist in other towns, is I think I alluded to it in one of our last meetings, is it's a group of people because the police the police can't enforce capacity.
Right.
So I think it has to be a group of people, but we're certainly willing to be part of that process. That's not a problem.
Selectman Anderson?
Yeah, I recall talking about having it be someone from the police, someone from fire, and someone from the Board of Health to get at the whole picture. Is that the
Yes, and I think
thing you were talking about?
Yarmouth may include the building department too.
building
You
department?
know, we tried that a few years ago, and I think there were some compliance checks done, but it hasn't been on a regular basis, and I think that it is a valuable thing to know that at any given moment, you know, that you could have a group of people that are gonna check your compliance with the regulations, show up and go through, you know, your establishment to make sure everything's in compliance.
Don?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I pivot back to the entertainment license? Because unless I'm reading this wrong, some of the violations of noise aren't really embodied in this, because they're talking about inside entertainment. No entertainment at the licensed premises shall be conducted in a manner such that the noise from the entertainment is creating a nuisance. And we have had tons of problems with the interrelation of the crowd with the entertainment, and the boisterous crowds creating much more noise than the entertainment itself.
We'll go right back to that, but can the board agree, and I think I'd like to hear from Joe, just to come back to the board when we bring this to a public meeting with a model. And for me, for the chief anyway, on the compliance piece of this, absent the group, it would be the board's, I would think it would be the board's choice to have the police chief or designee do a compliance inspection when he wants to do a compliance inspection. Certainly at the beginning of the year, beginning of their opening, but go in and ask, you know, where's your license? But Joe, do you want to speak of that? And then we'll get this part of it out of the way.
Sure, I think what was just said earlier by Selectman Anderson, and as the chief has said, in years past, the town of Harwich has had that cadre of inspectors go out, and when the chief informed me of that process when I came on board here, I emphasized then that I would make sure that we had representatives from health, building, and fire as it relates to that process, because we need it. And so the missing element is license compliance, and if the chief can identify several people, that would work out well. But that going forward, the expectation would be, there would be a representative from each of those regulatory bodies, or regulatory departments, I should say, building, health, fire, and police, that are gonna impact upon licensed establishments.
And the chief would be our designee from the local licensing authority for our part of the inspection.
Yes, I think the best way to say it is the chief and his designees.
Okay, so you'll come back to us with a proposal on that?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, now back to Don's question.
Well, Dawn, your question was that you're not sure that the liquor license regulations adequately capture some of the violations that we had. There were a couple of things going on here. Under the, and I think I mentioned this, under the statute for entertainment license, there is mention of essentially rowdy crowds. But when we were enforcing under 138 and your liquor license regulations. But your liquor license regulations at 1.10 B say licensees shall act reasonably and diligently to disperse loiterers or patrons who attempt to congregate in front of or at least premises. I think there was some of that going on. Failure of the licensee to keep people from congregating at the licensed premises may lead to disciplinary action against the licensee for allowing a public nuisance. Action to be taken by the licensee shall include maintaining a front door, asking loiterers to disperse, properly notifying the police, hiring a security guard, refusing to allow patrons to just walk in and out at short intervals, maintaining order in lines, announcing that no further patrons will be allowed. So, in my opinion, a lot of what went on out there, and I'm thinking of the one where there were lots and lots of people out in front of 2 or 3 establishments, is captured, at least under your liquor license regulations, in that particular section right there.
What section number?
I'm at,
Bottom of page 12.
I'm on, yeah, bottom of page 12, no, top of page 13B.
Jeff, if I could
Yeah, and
interject.
D, as the
If I
chief
could
just points
interject,
out.
though, my point was that we really weren't looking at a violation of the entertainment license as much as a flat-out violation of the
Liquor
of
license.
the liquor license
Yeah.
itself.
Yep, yep.
Because that part of it doesn't have anything to do with entertainment. It has to do with their responsibilities to make sure that they don't walk off with liquor off the premises, that they don't overpour, that there aren't rowdy crowds, and rowdy, I would say implies noise. But it's not just the entertainment license that's being violated, it's actually the license itself, the
Yeah,
underlying license.
and I think that they overlap a lot. You know, that was it, when we held the licensing hearings, we held them under chapter 138. We may or may not have been able to do it, we could have done it under both. But there's an awful lot of overlap, and as the chief pointed out, if you take a look at D of that same section, that really gets into the noise disturbances and the like. So that's exactly what we were going after.
And my point was, I didn't think that our licensees were exactly clear on that, because it isn't just peripheral. It's not the entertainment portion of your license, it's your license that says that.
It's all a part of that package.
Chief?
Yeah, and that's always been my philosophy, is that's where the big stick of the local licensing authority comes in. If you tie it to their liquor license, and it clearly is in the regulations, noise and disturbances, and the entertainment is in the liquor regulations as well. So I think it should all be considered a violation of the liquor license.
Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's what I was hoping to weigh in on earlier, to try and tie it together with our noise bylaw. And I've warned both the chair and the council that I was going to bring this up for discussion, but I feel as though when you read 109 and 110 of the regulations, that it negates any need for the noise bylaw, chapter 189, section G, by the way, which is entitled special permits, and I'll argue that in a moment, that it's unnecessary for it to be in there, because that reference under 189 of the bylaws, section G3, says that licenses offered under 138, so what it really talks about is the holders of licenses to provide alcoholic beverages, so we know that to be a Chapter 138 license, and/or entertainment, a Chapter 140, Section 183A license. Any conflict between those licenses and this bylaw, the licenses prevail. But further, shall also constitute a violation of the bylaws. I think that's a little bit redundant and also dangerous. First of all, for me, and bear with me as a reformed town clerk, clerks will tell you everywhere, as lawyers do as well, that words matter. Section G of the noise bylaw talks about special permits. Licenses under chapters 138 and 140 respectively are not permits. They're licenses. And so I think whatever good intention the town had back in 2010, 11, or 12, when that was added, sort of muddied the waters. And I note that the regulations were adopted by the town in 2011. And as Attorney Blake has said, I also believe that our town has solid regulations. And so for me, let's get rid of any reference in the noise bylaw regarding the licenses under the regulations, simply because I believe the regulations are more powerful. And we create a conflict by using the word conflict in the bylaw. And in the case of a conflict between individual license, allowance, or restrictions and the noise bylaw, the license shall apply.
Right.
And so I think it's cleaner as we talk about this, recognizing that it's easier under the statutes to modify regulations than bylaws. But I do think one of the things we should consider as a town, and we could do it as quickly as this annual town meeting, is to amend the noise bylaw to take that reference out, because it is not a special permit, and it is already covered under a regulatory process under state statute.
Thank you, Joe.
Or you may simply want to just, perhaps there was you may just want to letter that G and the next one H and the next one G, because that is that could be a standalone clause right there, provision. And have it say that the individual license prevails, and then if you want to strike the last part of it, I'm fine with that. But rather than have it under special permit, have it G 1, 2, and then H is the
new
clause
item
that we're
3.
talking about, H, and then the next one I.
And I do notice a lot of the towns that I'm looking at and following now that are dealing with some of our issues or considering dealing with some of our issues exempt the Chapter 138
And this is
licenses.
exactly what this is doing.
Right.
Right. So that would be your recommendation?
Correct. Just to alert everybody that we're relying upon the licenses when it comes to licensed establishments.
Don, I'll start with questions, comments.
Nothing on this, I've got.
You
some
support that change?
yeah.
Mary?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Larry? And I support it. So we can draft that, and then we'll bring that as part of our global package back to a public meeting. And then I agree, Joe, if we can get that done this year, or at least presented to the town this year, that would make sense. Chief, anything on that? Thoughts?
So just so I'm clear, you're agreeing to actually exempt 138 licensees from the noise bylaw, because any and all potential noise violations are covered within the regulation?
Yes.
That's a strict.
Yep.
Yep.
Yes. So 100% agree.
Thank you. All right, where are we now? Mary?
I got a couple more questions. One is, I think it might have been the chief's recommendation, but tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, that we also request some random reviews by ABC. And,
Yes, you did mention it.
I think we should do that. They've got teeth, plus that takes a little of the burden off the chief, have them do it. And the other question, and I think this one is for you, Jeff, looking at the violations that we had last year, and like Michael had said when he opened, I was extremely disappointed, situations that looked absolutely dead wrong. Our belief was they would fail on appeal to ABC. Can you comment on that what we need in that package to succeed there?
I guess with some of them, we were relying upon witnesses that wouldn't testify. I'm thinking of, for one, an underage service of somebody who had a fake ID that we only got secondhand knowledge from. It would have been very difficult for me to go to the ABCC, even though our detective sergeant?
Yes.
Yeah, even though our detective sergeant, I think, did a great job, he was only able to talk to somebody over the phone. And then oftentimes it was somebody who knew the young lady who had been going into somebody's house or had been overserved. And so I think that those are some of the things that are very, very difficult. Some of the noise violations that we had. I think what happens was when the police department got a complaint, any complaint, of course, they go out and investigate it, and then they brought it up to you to say, look, this is something that we had here. Maybe there should be an interim step where somebody along the line makes the determination as to whether or not to send it up the chain, rather than every single thing that went up. And what I'm thinking of is there was one there where there was a noise complaint. And once it was investigated, first of all, the officers went out and heard nothing in the parking lot. But every once in a while, a door would open and it would come out. I mean, those are the kind of things that I think, fairly read, our regulation, while it says you have to keep the noise within the building, I think really fairly read, it doesn't mean that every time you open a door, the band has to stop. And that's why there are other provisions here where we have a door person, where maybe talking with that, and actually I think the officers did. They talked to the door person, said, look, you gotta cool it, you gotta make sure that people aren't going out constantly and that door is being left open, and I think it was remedied. But again, I think that would have been a very difficult case to prosecute at the ABCC.
Joe?
So, thank you. First, I feel compelled to respond only because we're making Attorney Blake sort of justify the actions and the decisions that I had made. And we didn't have a conversation on that, but all I would add is, and again, rely upon Attorney Blake, the other element that is sort of looming over that is the process that I, as your hearing officer for cause, undertake, and then the hearing that you folks undertake as local licensing authority is different than what would then happen at ABCC under appeal. And the phrase that I've heard attorneys make reference to is that it's a de novo hearing. And that is the applicant, the licensee, really, my words, no one else's, and if I'm incorrect, please correct it, Jeff, set the tone for the appeal hearing, meaning they are allowed to have witnesses that we never relied upon or could compel to come before us. So they're creating a whole new hearing. And that's their right under the ABCC proceedings, because it's my understanding that that's the right under case law. And so the whole aspect of it changes when you get to the ABCC level. So that, as Attorney Blake said, we could try to prevail upon witnesses, but not to the same way that the ABCCs can. So when it gets to that level, if we have recalcitrant witnesses or witnesses that just don't want to participate, they then may show up at an ABCC hearing, and it's the first time we have to deal with them. So it really changes the playing field, if you will. That's the bad news. For me, the good news is we have very solid regulations going forward, and a lot of the benefit of this workshop today is to be able to put everyone on notice that if it's in our regs, and we think you violated it, that would be a show cause hearing, that would be a hearing before the board. And as Attorney Blake said, one of the things the ABCC asks the towns when you go, because unfortunately I have experience with that, is, do you have regulations? Yes. Did you provide regulations to your establishments? Yes. Did you conduct your hearings in accordance with the regulations? Yes. And so that in the future will go a long way towards doing what we weren't able to do in 2021.
Now, you set with that?
I am, thank you.
Don?
Yeah, I'm actually interested in the exact same area, the process, and how it gets executed. I got the impression the record that was brought in at the commencement of whatever the hearing was it. I mean, and I'm a little concerned because some part of this is you can't know what you don't know when you don't know it. I mean, if somebody just shows up at a hearing, are we considering that there's a prospect that they could be a material witness and recognizing them, or is it already set in stone that the file is already there?
From my point of view, from when I was prosecuting these things before your administrator, we certainly would, in fact, I think at one of them, there was a question of an underage person who was being served, and there were photographs. And the person who took the photographs was in the audience, and we questioned him. So to answer your question, if we get that information, yeah, we will. But a lot of the times, these folks don't want to come in and don't want to testify.
I'm actually not talking about that. I'm talking about, there's a difference. There's moving parts here. Somebody who experienced the actual incident, who was in proximity, was a witness, may not know the existence of the hearing.
Okay, yeah. I don't know if they were made aware of the hearings.
And I'm trying to make sure that things don't, progress down the road absent evidence merely because somebody just didn't know that this was happening and didn't show up.
Joe?
I think then one of the remedies to that going forward is, and I've tried to talk about the differences, meaning when the board conveys something to me as your administrator for hearing, it's to determine, to show cause, to find out if there's ample information for you folks to then conduct a hearing that may include punishment and/or revocation. Am I saying that correctly?
Right.
So that if I discover something at the hearing process at my level where something's missing, going forward, I may be able to rely upon the use of counsel to notify individuals that they would be asked to participate in the board hearing. But again, we still lack the abilities that are at the ABCC level. We can't subpoena, to my knowledge.
A Board of Selectmen may be able to, but certainly not at the show cause level, I don't believe.
So I couldn't subpoena, but you folks could, but that takes on a whole new level. But I think to Selectman Howell's point, going forward, we could rely upon show cause to try and identify things that were missed that may not be at my hearing level, to try to bring them to the board's hearing level. Having said that, however, that's going to run into conflict with one of the board's earlier preferences, and that is that your hearings don't take on the life that my hearings have. So adding more witnesses adds more onus on the local licensing authority and council through Attorney Blake, not so much the chief and I. At that point, you could spend your evenings doing hearings like I spent my days doing hearings. Not that that's good or bad, but just changes the complexion of it, I think.
I'd say bad, but go ahead, Don.
Thank you. What I'm really driving at here is, I mean, I'm pretty sure everybody in the room feels this, is that if we can establish a baseline, we're not going to be doing this forever, because there's going to be a clear understanding that if this happens, then this will occur after that. And I'm fairly certain that vigorous enforcement on the front end results in less enforcement being required later on. Having said that, and I know Mary had displeasure over it, and I kind of felt the same way. It's like, we're not realistically going through this if there's a finding of insufficient evidence. We're not saying, not so fast, we're going to relitigate that. We're pretty much riffing off of that finding, and that's the end of it. That's why I'm kind of concerned that we make sure up front that if somebody comes forward, or if we know that there might be somebody that's not recalcitrant, they're willing, but they don't know about the hearing, that we kind of seek that out, because I'd love to be able to get this thing resolved over a 1 or 2 year arc so that we don't have this as a pervasive problem forever.
Agreed.
Page 17, C, top of the page, C. At the
Page?
17. And it mentions the hearing authority hear evidence from the police chief and his agents and/or witnesses or from other complaining parties. So historically, correct me if I'm wrong, Attorney Blake, but we have not been inviting civilian witnesses to these events. They choose to show up, and my, personal opinion is, through my experience testifying in criminal matters, a lot of the times a judge or a jury is gonna believe civilians over police officers. That's an unfortunate reality we've witnessed. Doesn't make it right, but I mean, you know what I mean? It does exist sometimes. So my opinion is, if there's a civilian witness that can bolster our case, why aren't we using them? You know what I mean? And
I think we should.
Yeah.
And I guess we will. I mean, part of it is, for example, a lot of the noise complaints are your officers alone.
Right.
Right, did you hear it? And then we get into the, how far out was it? How often? Et cetera, et cetera.
And I'm not really interested in hammering anybody for what's happened. I'm just interested in what we could do to make something more happen.
Right, build a stronger case.
Yeah.
Yes.
With the goal of stopping the whole problem, you know?
I think that's the most important piece, because I think we have come a long way, and I think last summer, some of the complaints from the year before didn't happen. I mean, I do think that we've made a lot of progress, and this exercise is to go to the next level, so that we're all very clear on what we're doing as far as liquor regulations, and then the hearing process, we rely on our town administrator, and I think rightfully so, to have the hearing, and I think he's done a great job with those. I do know at one of the hearings that came back before us, one resident said, I wasn't invited to speak. I couldn't speak. So I think the message from the board now is, let's invite whoever wants to speak to speak. Sorry, that's gonna take more of your time. But, again, hopefully we're heading in the direction where we're not doing this anymore. Go ahead, Joe.
And I promise I'll be brief on that one. And just to be clear, at the show cause hearing level, Attorney Blake is prosecuting the allegations provided by the police, meaning I don't believe it's appropriate for the hearing officer to say, I'll accept you as a witness. The question was, does the town want to present that person as a witness? And I think going forward, I'll defer to Attorney Blake and Chief Gilmet on that, but they could. But that was that particular instance that I asked the question, is the town looking for this to be a witness? And at the time, the town wasn't.
Okay, thank you, Joe. We're good on this subject, Larry?
Yeah, it's good discussion, I agree with it. I did like Jeff, yours comment too, that I'm interested in interim steps, so not everything goes to a hearing.
And we did have that
Because
conversation.
that's
Right.
that really troubles me, that we're burying ourselves with, we're gonna have to go back and relook at some of our baseline criteria, I think, to make that happen, but we need to minimize that process and use it responsibly.
I agree, and I believe we've addressed that. I believe in one of our last conversations where the discretion really is on the police chief. I think he rightfully so is keeping a record of it and police reports on it, but to get it to our level is gonna be, this is egregious enough where there should be a hearing, right?
Correct. And one of my comments on that, though, was that it does say within the regulation in the hearing process that the board is the one that is to decide. So, in other words, I would word a memo, and if we go with that process, that, okay, this occurred, so you're aware of it, what it was, what happened. It's my recommendation that it not move forward to a hearing. And then you decide, does that sound?
Yeah, I think that sounds perfect. Yep.
Board's in agreement?
Yes.
Joe, anything?
Yes, just to say that exactly what the chief said is a transaction between the chief and the board as local licensing authority. As a potential hearing officer, I would not be involved in any way, shape, or form with that transaction because it would be prejudicial.
Thank you.
So I think that's perfect the way it's been discussed.
So then,
Chief.
if I had a question on a close call, then obviously I'd be authorized to communicate with Attorney Blake regarding that.
Yes.
Trying to save you folks work.
Yes. Okay, moving on. Danielle and I have had several conversations about this, and last week we had an applicant, or 2 weeks ago, we had an applicant that applied for Monday through Sunday, 6 a.m., because that's when they open, until 1 a.m., because that's when they close, for an entertainment license. Because they want to cover themselves, and I think rightfully so with everything that's going on, and they go in the morning for breakfast, and they flip on their Sonos radio. and they may throw the TV on to watch the news. And it's been asked, and I'm not sure what the answer is, do they need an entertainment license, and how much minutia are we gonna fire at Danielle to put on these licenses? Do we approve a radio and television license from 6 AM to, say, 1 PM on Sunday, but no live entertainment because the state statute, I believe, is 1 PM on? So the question is, do we need to issue entertainment licenses for radios and televisions?
I think technically speaking that it would fall within the entertainment license. We have traditionally, certainly with respect to televisions, we have advised that they need an entertainment license. I can tell you, I think that there's an awful lot of communities out there that have ignored that. But the simple fact of the matter is, if these folks are applying for their license, then I see no issue with you conditioning the license that says from 6 AM to 1 AM, you can have your radio and TV going, and from 1 PM to, whatever, to 12 PM, you can have amplified music inside and acoustical music out, I know that it's putting a little bit more of a burden on Danielle, but if these folks want it, and I think that televisions certainly require it, and amplified music, recorded or live music is required to have an entertainment license, so I think arguably a radio would as well. So I see no legal impediment to you breaking it up like that, and that would protect the established, give the establishments the comfort they're looking for.
Thank you, Jeff. Joe?
And going forward, FERS, Ms. Delaney has done exceptional work in stealing from other communities, if I can say it that way. We have a universal pact amongst communities. Reallocating, thank you, Selectman Howell. We're gonna use that one going forward. But she's already done great efforts to accomplish that kind of thing going forward in our applications. And we can certainly share that with the board ahead of time before we utilize those. But one of the points I want to make clear is, and I couldn't agree more with what Attorney Blake just said. However, I want to put the emphasis out there that when you condition the license, then when we go back to those inspections, that's one of the things that has to be inspected. When somebody on behalf of the town goes into an establishment and the radio's on or the TV's on, they would want to look on the face of the entertainment license to see if it was licensed. Because if they're operating that and they don't have one, that's a potential violation of both their 140 and potentially their Chapter 138, correct?
Through your regs. But I think something like that would probably be somebody didn't know. I
Right.
know ignorance is no excuse, but thinking that you have to have an entertainment license for a TV and a radio, I mean, it may come to a shock for somebody, but certainly your inspector would be authorized to just write a warning or something. You got to do this, get it done in 30 days.
Anything further, Joe?
Nope.
So the board's in agreement, and really it's incumbent upon the board when we make our motions to say on this one particular one in Harwich Center, it's 6 AM to 1 PM on Sunday, radio and television. And then if we do an indoor entertainment license, 1 PM to 8, which I believe is this statute. And I guess I'm getting at consistency, and Danielle's done a great job giving us matrix, and we can get updated matrix anytime we want. So some sort of consistency in our motions is gonna be needed so that Danielle can translate in the morning what we actually voted. Anything on that, Larry?
No, I agree. I look towards Danelle and Joe to give us specific language for the motions, so we're, because sometimes we get lazy and say so moved.
Yeah.
We need to move away from that and be specific in our discussions. I'm in agreement with it.
Chief?
If you finished, I'd just like to mention on page 12 here, under outside entertainment, I know Attorney Blake and I have had conversation on this. There's a line there that, and I know Taylor Powell's had issues with this line as well. I think this section needs some clarity. It says, not plainly audible at a distance of 150 feet from the boundary line or source of sound amplification system, whichever is further. I think there is some conflict on what that actually means, and we may want to look at clearing that up.
Because what we were talking about is, from whose point of view are you talking about? From the
Exactly.
outside in or the inside out?
Exactly.
And I think it's from the outside in, but
So let me get right back to that. Don, you're on the motion thing, being very specific, you're good with that?
I'm fine. I've actually been asking us to add language that says, and any other restrictions that have been previously imposed.
Okay.
So
Mary?
it's important to keep those things perpetual.
Yeah, I just have one question on the TV radio thing.
Go ahead.
That's going to be incumbent upon the applicant to ask for that. We're not automatically doing TV and radio for everybody,
Fairly
correct?
certain Danielle added that to the application.
Okay. So it'll depend
So
if they ask for that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. But I'm okay with
Okay,
this part.
now going on to the clarification, and Chief, that has come up several times. So Jeff, any comments on that? And then I'll go to Joe.
I mean, my comment is that I understand, I see the ambiguity there. And you're right, we have had these conversations, and I think that it could be easily tweaked to something to the effect where we would just say plainly audible at a distance of 150 feet from the source of sound amplification system, or something like, but get rid of the boundary, or just say from the boundary. I mean, I don't, maybe it is from the boundary, maybe it is from the property lines, 150 feet from the property line, whichever we decide we want, but let's not put both in and say whichever is further. We'll just say from X or from Y.
Joe?
So, first, I'm going to reallocate from Selectman Howell, because you taught me that phrase. And say that my only concern with that discussion is, and the board's already talked about it with different licenses and with different hearings in the past. Harwich Board is completely different than North Harwich, which is completely different from East Harwich, West Harwich, Pleasant Lake, and so on and so forth. And by the way, that's me trying to show off that I know some of our village names of the 7 villages. But point on that one would be, Selectman Howell informed us, and it was very impactful on me, or to me, that when you talk about Harwich Port, he indicated in past service that he understood that, and I'm saying it wrong, so I'd be looking to signal him to correct me as well, but that the district itself, known as that village, isn't far greater than 150 feet. So we may want to consider, and I know it adds complexity to the regulations, do we want to look at references to certain villages or districts?
I'll start with Don.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I note that our colleague, Selectman Kavanaugh, has rejoined us.
You're absolutely right, and that's I was going to get to that. If you start reverting to 150 feet from the property line, given what the Harwich Port zoning is, you're literally doubling the size of the establishment. Because then if it's 150 feet that they own, and you take 150 feet from the boundary, now you're at 300 feet. And it's going to cause a problem because there's a lot of abutting residences there.
Mary?
I do agree that's confusing, but I guess I'm comfortable with the boundary. Whatever, those properties down there are tiny. They don't have acres. So why wouldn't it be the boundary to 150 feet? Which is going to be the furthest because the entertainment has to be within. So I would make it the boundary and.
Chief?
And I think this was what Taylor was getting at. I think that puts large businesses with a lot of property at an advantage versus a small one in Harwich Port when you go by boundary line. And we could have a problem with that if there's a house in there that's, say 200 feet away, but their actual boundary line, is somehow laid out. So, I don't know, I'm starting to confuse myself, but I mean, this has always confused me, and my personal opinion is that it should be source of amplification. I don't even know where whichever's further phrase come from, because it's not in the noise bylaw.
Huh.
So, I would say source of sound amplification system.
Thank you.
Or
Larry?
to
Jeff, go ahead.
add, I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
To add a little bit, either that or perhaps a building wall. And the only reason I say that is
A what?
because your officers use their LiDAR.
Yep.
And it'd be hard for them to go inside the building. I mean, I don't know. I mean, source of sound amplification, I'm sure your officers would simply use the building, get their LiDAR reading, and if it's over 150 feet, it's clearly gonna be more because they're inside the building. So maybe I'm more complicating it more than needs to be.
Larry?
This is a fun discussion. I'm uncomfortable with a point, just because you can move that around so much. I like the boundary. And it was not too difficult. I could see us doing it by district. Harwich Port, maybe we restrict that to 50 feet or 100 feet from the boundary. It makes sense. Because the boundary is something we know. The point source will move around. That would, at least that would clarify it. And I don't know if it's a lot of work to do it by region, because I think, Joe, as you mentioned, where out the, Pleasant Lake, it's not the same concern as it is in the Harwich Port.
Julie, the conversation right now is on the part of the regulation that says from source of amplification or boundary, whichever is greater. And it's been suggested that we clean that up. The chief said that that's confusing, and I know Taylor Powell from PERC had brought that up several times, that he thought that was confusing. I don't know how much of the conversation you heard. Boundary was one. Larry just said boundary, but further restricting, say, Harwich Port. What are your thoughts on boundary versus source of amplification?
So I think I like the boundary because it is a definitive mark, and I agree, like, the source of amplification can be difficult, it moves. But at the same token, I appreciate what the chief is saying, is if it's, you could go from the boundary and have a house within that 150 feet in Harwich Port. So I guess if I had to pick one, I would say the boundary, and I guess there needs to be some sort of caveat if we've got a property within it, and I don't know how we address that technically.
And my preference would be boundary, because I think that is a set point that the police officers could use. And there are some disadvantages and advantages depending on what the property is. Mm-hmm. But in Harwich Port, a lot of people have said there is it got out of hand, but there's also the, Jeff, you and I spoke of this morning, when the traffic stopped 150 feet, you could hear the music at 150 feet. But when the cars are going by and there's walking noise and other things, you couldn't hear it. So I think boundary makes sense, and I would hate to restrict these businesses any more than we already have. And I think in the liquor regulations, the nuisance clause can be used if we're getting complaints on these businesses. So it would no longer be about the 150-foot noise bylaw. We would go to nuisance. Mm-hmm. So if we get 15 calls on a restaurant down there, we could rely on our liquor regulations and not further restrict these businesses or hamstring our officers into trying to figure out source of amplification at 150 feet. So I would support boundary, and I would leave the 150 feet alone. And just remind the board that Witchmere Harbor Club is in Harwich Port. So source of amplification for Witchmere Harbor would be their front gate. So how much are we going to restrict these businesses based on property? And I think we'd be really putting ourselves and the town in a bad position on enforcement. Chief?
So maybe we could just clarify that further, if that's the wish of the board to go boundary, that it would be the boundary line of the licensed premises, correct? Mm-hmm. So is that potentially different from all the property that it's on? Is the licensed premises usually just the building itself that it's?
Premise shows parking lots and everything else.
Yeah,
It's the locus.
Yeah, I think in the way we're doing it now, it would be the property line.
Okay. However, it was just, we just need to have that clear, that's all. Absolutely crystal clear that this is so for this particular establishment, their boundary line is here, and that's where we're measuring the 150 back.
Yes. Joe?
I'm trying to appoint myself to be the person to ask all the bad questions, but if we rely upon nuisance, which I think is a good approach, should we include nuisance in outdoor entertainment? Because it has become a nuisance, I think, for residents and patrons in and around Harwich Board.
I
We
think-
use that reference to indoor entertainment. Do we want to rely upon nuisance anywhere else in the regulations?
I think a
Because I think it's a useful word.
I think a nuisance is a nuisance wherever it is. Don?
I'm waiting for this to get off this subject, because there's a couple of things that are really important to me.
Okay. Mary, anything on this?
No, but I'm with Joe. Nuisance is nuisance. And if it needs to be clarified that it's both inside and outside, we should clarify that.
Larry?
Yes, and I'm hoping we're moving in a direction by not allowing acoustic or amplified music outside as well, which should help us.
Julie?
Yeah, I guess the only other point I would make on the boundary is that we need to make that information easily available to the officers because, they're going to need that reference point. If we're going to say boundary could be a lot line of a parking lot, et cetera, I mean, how are they going to know that? You know what I'm saying?
I would agree with you with the exception of in Harwich Port where the bulk of the cases are, and in Harwich Center, the property line is very, very simple. It's the sidewalk. And most of these buildings stop at the sidewalk. But yes, Julie, I think that's easily obtainable information for the police department.
Yeah, just to make it easier. It's been hard enough, so.
That clear enough, Jeff, what we're looking at? Thank you. Don, I will go to you. So we're done with the TV, we're done with that, 150. Don, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking now at things that may be at the periphery of all of this, but still they're problematic. And one is particularly an emerging problem. Just as people were buying up homes to use on Airbnb for renters, we are starting to get a lot of requests that are one-off, one-day entertainment and liquor licenses, but they're not really, aside from the fact that they may be violating zoning because they're in residential areas, but there's a cottage industry that's emerging, purchasing grandiose premises and then advertising them as wedding reception sites. So they're not really one. I don't even know how we could possibly enforce anything we're talking about here if we continuously treat serial one-day licenses as one-day licenses.
Or exempt from the noise bylaw.
Yeah.
When you say serial one-day license, you got people that are coming in and asking for a one-day license every other day?
No. But I mean, every couple of months, they've got another reception that they've organized because it's a destination wedding.
Yep. I mean, that's a fairly common use of a one-day license. Whether or not they're violating zoning, I think, is for the ZBA or for the
I get
building
that.
inspector. But I guess, I mean, the liquor license regulations apply to licenses, and to the extent that there is any ambiguity, we can put in, they apply to one-day licenses as well. So they would have the same obligations under this as anyone else.
What would be the remedy for a violation, though? Because we've been experiencing people showing up with, okay, I want an entertainment license because we've got the wedding band showing up.
Yep, great point. What would be I mean, if you have people who are consistently doing this an entity that does this, the
Well, that's what I'm asking for. Where's that line?
Joe?
Couldn't,
I mean, what do you mean by, I guess I don't understand.
Where's the line of frequency that would make you say that it's really a real license that's intermittently being used as opposed to a one-day license that's being issued serially?
And hang on to that thought, Jeff. Joe, I think you have an answer.
well, for me, and Ms. Delaney and I have worked on this regularly throughout most of the seasons, certainly in 2021. We've gone to great lengths to remind, and I'll say petitioners, to use a word that we haven't used yet, not applicants, but petitioners, where we would tell them that, there is an entertainment license, which is a function of Chapter 140, Section 183A, that we've heard Attorney Blake and we've talked about all morning. And in many instances, that those are requested by Chapter 138 licensees. Why couldn't we consider a non-138 establishment or a non-138 applicant or petitioner to be seeking a special permit under Chapter 189 as was originally conceived? For example, and applicants have tried to use this against the town, I think with no success, but the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce every year seeks what I would consider to be a special permit for music in the port. And we in the town, on behalf of the town, have said to anybody that questions it, that is not a Chapter 138 establishment. They're not serving booze. They're not serving food. It's a special event, and it's a permit under Chapter 189. So for me, I would no longer call it a one-day entertainment license. I would call it a permit for entertainment under Chapter 189. I don't know if that's parsing words, Attorney Blake, but to me, that might be the better way to go, because what we're talking about, I think, is, again, licenses under a statute that are a privilege and can be revoked, and that's the privilege of serving alcohol and food while having entertainment and vice versa and all of that, versus a group such as the Chamber of Commerce or other type things, or private residences that may want to have some party. I wouldn't put them together, but I would say that the mechanism would be an application for special permit under the bylaw, separate and distinct, and it's not the board acting as the local licensing authority, it's the Board of Selectmen acting as the Board of Selectmen under Chapter 189. So at least we can get it away from, it's not what we've called it in years past.
I'm not talking about that.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not talking about that. And I have a feeling that the pandemic has obscured this, but there are other towns that are starting to grapple with it. If we haven't gotten that point yet, we will. People are advertising that they will have it's not like I'm going to have a reception for my kid's wedding at my house. It is, I'm going to have a series of receptions with alcohol and with entertainment over the course of the summer, a number of them. And it has nothing to do with the chamber, which I totally agree is a different circumstance. But if we don't at least think about this now, there's going to be a time, again, where's that tipping point? How many licenses of one day are you going to get as a request before you start saying, no, you're actually operating an ongoing establishment?
So I'll agenda this, we'll do this, because this doesn't, it applies, but we don't have to.
Yeah, I'm just worried about the future.
Yeah,
for this.
so we definitely will agenda that for the future, that conversation. And if you go on, you can go online, people rent their houses in Harwich Port as wedding venues. So, I personally don't want to take that away from them. I mean, I think it brings a lot of people to town, brings business to town. I think it's a great idea. But to Don's point, how are we going to monitor, what are we going to charge, and what are we going to give them a permit? Now, Danielle and I have had this conversation. Some people apply for entertainment licenses when they want to add to Harwich ports, and this board has denied them. So, music in the port, we had somebody that came before us and they wanted to add a band, and the board thought it was going to set a precedent, so they denied that person. Somebody else in Harwich Port frequently has entertainment at their establishment, and there's never been any complaints. So some people follow it, some people don't. Why would we, if we issue a special permit, because this has come up, do we exempt them from the noise bylaw in that special permit? And why do we? And we don't have to.
Well, I think, if I may, Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
I think it's within the bylaw itself, so you can apply for the special permit, and then if you look previous to that under exemptions, under 12, noises for which the Board of Selectmen has granted a special permit, and that's an exemption.
Permit.
Yeah.
So can we should look at changing that, whereas you have to, that we're not exempting the noise bylaw. And then if we don't exempt the noise bylaw, in the noise bylaw, unrelated to Chapter 139, there's a fine structure. There's a warning.
Then you're
First
doing
warning.
away with the music in the port.
What's that?
Essentially, you'd be doing away with the Wednesdays at the port.
I don't think so, because it's a town-sponsored event, but I think we'd have to clean that language up. Joe?
No, I would argue that that use is covered under 189 F9, parades, music festivals, public gatherings, and events for which the selectmen have issued a permit.
Thank you.
Again, use the word permit, not license, and I think we're okay for that particular use that we talked about with the chamber.
We can, if Danielle gets an application for one of these special permits, when we vote them on Monday nights, we don't have to vote them and do away with the noise bylaw. We could vote them that they have to comply, and we've done that recently.
I was gonna say, that's what we've done.
Right, that they have to comply with the noise bylaw. So I don't think we really need to change anything, except for maybe add the language that we're gonna give you a special permit, but you have to abide by the noise bylaw.
If I could, the only thing I think we would change is that we would have a specific form, no longer relying upon the one-day license. We can establish a special permit under bylaw to make it completely different.
Okay.
And I hope that was a
That was a
response.
thumbs
Yeah.
up from Danielle.
Right.
So she's been looking for clarification on this, so we
Correct.
will look for you to present
Yep,
to us as
absolutely.
part of this global change, that change.
Makes sense?
Can we move on to a different subject?
We can move on to, Larry, do you have anything on that?
Nope,
You
I'm
good?
fine with it.
Mary, you're good on that?
I'm good on that.
Then Don, go ahead.
Yeah, this is on the other side of the periphery here. This has been driving me nuts, and I'll give you one example. The dormant license problem. How long can we allow people to just hold a license that's not going to be exercised? We had one license that was held by a lessee of a building that he no longer had a lease in, and it went on for a year.
Pocket license,
Yeah.
under chapter 138.
And how long are we obligated to forbear that, as opposed to saying, turn the license in?
The ABCC, there's a fair amount of decisions on that. The ABCC has come down that you have to make them aware that there's an issue with it, that they have to exercise their license. You got to give them at least 6 months to exercise it. So you drag them in for a hearing. You tell them, hey, look, you haven't exercised this license in, pick a number of time, in 3 months. We are putting you on notice that if you don't exercise this license within 6 months, we're going to revoke it.
Danielle's making great notes.
I think she knows the establishment I'm talking about.
Yeah, we all
It just,
know.
there doesn't seem to be any control, because then when they obtain the transfer after a year, they still haven't exercised the license in more than a year.
Yeah, that's a classic pocket license, and there is, the ABCC has said 6 months.
Okay.
So it's just another thing, Don, that we have to clean up and enforce.
That's what I was
And
going
also, I believe your regulations would require you to hold the initial hearing, and then you can bring them in again in 3 months. So you might do that. You hold the initial hearing, bring them in 3 months, and say, look, we really mean it, and then after 6 months, go forward and revoke.
But there needs to be a show cause of some sort. You send them a letter and.
Yeah, we need to notify, notice an opportunity to be heard.
Okay.
Come on in and let's talk about your license. And oh, by the way, understand that we're talking about suspension, revocation, or modification.
Joe?
So if I think I understand the establishments, plural, in question, and to the original issue with the lessor, or the lessee, they applied for renewal under a seasonal, which was their right. Once they obtained it, they then entertained a transaction with a new establishment. That new establishment was granted the seasonal license and did not use it during the season. I know there's a difference with the ABCC with regard to pocket licenses, annual vis-a-vis seasonal. And so I don't know that we've had issues with annual pocket licenses. With regard to the establishment in question, the town could remedy that with the next renewal process of the seasonal license in that particular example.
Thank you. Good, right?
I agree.
Okay. Julie, anything on this?
No, I think I need to wrap my head around it a little bit better. The only thing I would say on the special permits is that depending on if we're talking about people who truly would have a wedding at their house for, and it's not a serial quote unquote type of situation, a special permit's gonna require some planning in terms of calendar stuff, but I suppose that's not probably a big deal.
Thank you. Larry?
Nothing more to add.
Okay, Mary?
I'm good.
Don?
No, I'm not talking about, I just got to be very clear about this. I'm not talking about my daughter needs to be married and she loves our house and she's coming back and we're going to have it at our house. I'm talking about the person who might be applying for the license being a different person than who owns the house, because the person who owns the house is doing kind of an Airbnb for weddings.
Attorney Blake, we've been accused, or it's been suggested by somebody that we have to do for one what we do for the other, meaning that all of our permits and all of our licenses related to entertainment on the liquor licenses have to be consistent, or we're creating an unfair business practice. My own view is, and we did this a few years ago in West Harwich, transfer ownership. We had a public hearing, the neighbors came out, we listened to everybody and agreed. I don't think the business owner was as happy as the neighbors were, but agreed that they could have music Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 4 to 8. We don't have to be consistent at all, do we? I mean, in the end, it's about public hearings, it's about the area that we're licensing, it's about the size of the facility, the proximity of the neighbors. We as a local licensing authority have the leeway to put restrictions on whatever we want, right?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, you have to treat similarly situated establishments the same. And that means similarly situated. You have a place here right in town with neighbors that are 25 yards off their boundary versus a place that's somewhere that's 3 acres, that's right smack in the middle with no neighbors. Obviously, when you're going to issue an entertainment license, noise to the neighbors, which is absolutely something that you can consider in both your liquor licenses and your entertainment licenses, you got to take those into account. And you can take those into account. So for the person who's in town right here, close, you can reduce their hours. You can, make them take more measures to reduce the sound that travels outside their boundaries. To the person that's out there on 3 acres with nobody around, they're not going to be able. The ill that you're trying to cure, that is the noise to the neighbors, is different. So you can condition it differently.
Thank you. And if we have similarly situated facilities, and we're not getting a bunch of complaints from one, but we are getting complaints from the other, and we've tried to mitigate the other, and somebody in one purchases a house system and really knows how to control the volume, and I think I'm speaking to what Larry mentioned a minute ago on going more acoustic than amplified, is there a problem with the local licensing authority taking all that into consideration and permitting one for amplified music because they've demonstrated control and not the other?
I think that, based on the track record, that they no longer are similarly situated, right? So, again, you are the local licensing authority, you're given this authority, and it's held within you because you know what's going on here. So, yes, if there's one establishment that when it gets a amplification permit for outside, we get noise complaints every single day, versus the other one who's close by or in a similar situation, we give them the amplified music permit, and we've never gotten a complaint. Yeah, you can take that into account.
Thank you.
Yes, those are factors that you weigh.
Okay. Mary?
Related to that, when we do random checks, is there any problem if we focus with establishments we've had a problem with?
I mean, I guess I would prefer that we, if we're going to do random checks, that I think by definition, random is random. So that we, I don't know, draw from a hat, do whatever we do. We ultimately probably want to check every single establishment in town. So if it's random, it should be random and not necessarily single out. But that's a random check. Now, obviously, if we're having trouble with some establishments, there's nothing to prevent us from not doing a random check, but simply a check.
Yeah, and maybe I shouldn't have used the word random, doing those compliance checks. Is there a problem doing compliance checks at places we have had problems?
No, I mean, that's why we do compliance checks, because we're
okay.
having problems.
Well, one thing I think that needs to be cleaned up is when we talk about indoor entertainment, Chief, I know you focused on this a bit through the hearing process and in conversations that we had after that. Indoor entertainment has to stay within the bounds of the building, in the indoors. So if we have a facility who have demonstrated nothing but professionalism, very, very, very few complaints, I only remember one, in the middle of Harwich Port, and they have outdoor seating, and they have an indoor bar with a window that slides open, and they have a dining room, and they have some indoor entertainment, and that window's open. Is there a suggestion on how we should license that place? Because clearly, even the noise coming from the bar with the window open exceeds the property line, because they're on the sidewalk. We don't have a problem with them. But I know one tact from other businesses is now, if they're the center of attention, that they're gonna complain about the other businesses.
So you're,
Personally, I think that's very unfair, but we should be able to give this business direction on what they apply for.
well, it says here that from the noise from the entertainment is creating a nuisance and can be heard outside the boundary of the premises.
So nuisance
So,
again.
so it's a nuisance, right? And if it becomes a nuisance, then I don't know that you can actually license a nuisance, right? By definition, you can't.
So if the police department comes by and the window's down on the cruiser and they can hear, as they're driving by, they can hear the conversation or maybe a band playing on the inside, but they can hear it, that's not a violation.
Is it a nuisance?
I would argue no.
So, but if the cruiser goes by and they hear it and they've gotten 7 complaints from neighbors, then it's
That's a nuisance.
probably a nuisance.
Yeah.
Chief?
Yeah, I don't think you're ever gonna be able to remove the subjective piece of that type of a situation. We are going to try very hard. We're going to be bringing a trainer in on these regulations, and all this is very, very valuable for us, and the more we can clear it up, the better. But I understand where you're going with that. It does seem a little bit unreasonable if there aren't any complaints that you get one call from an anonymous caller saying, I can hear that on the sidewalk. Does that fit the definition of a nuisance? And no, in my opinion, it wouldn't. And these are the things that I need to be able to pass on to my officers and obviously realize myself when I'm reviewing the reports.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to end this by 12:15, so very quickly I'm going to go to closing comments from board members, and then the town administrator, and then both of you. Is there any other subject that the board wants? Don? Mary?
No, I think we did it.
I'm fine, Michael.
Julie, anything further you want to add before we go to closing statements?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay. I guess the last legal question I would have, Jeff, and this happened to this board, well, happened to a past board. A applicant comes in, applies for, we have a public hearing, they apply for one thing, whether it be a jazz band or a steel drum band or whatever, for awaiting patrons to go in and have dinner. And then the next year that evolves into something else. Is that a notice from the local licensing authority that we didn't permit you for that? Because if it renews and they did it, I would assume they're gonna claim that we renewed it for a different purpose.
Well, I think that we'd have to, first of all, look at the application and what was licensed that very first time. And if they are morphing, I mean, if they come for a renewal for the license that we issued last year, and that was for an acoustical guitar, and we renew them for the acoustical guitar, and all of a sudden we find out that they've got a 5-piece, heavy metal band out there, then that's a revocation, suspension, modification hearing, saying this is what your permit's for, this is what you're doing. Rather than, the renewal, if they went and said the renewal is for, or strike that, the original is for the one guy acoustic out there, and then they wanted to renew for the 5-piece band, and we renewed it, well, then we've essentially renewed a license for them to do the 5-piece band.
Thank you. Anything, Don?
Yeah, actually, on that subject, yeah, I've said everything else I wanted to say, but the pandemic has created a hell of a mess.
Yep.
Because things that were originally given in recognition of the burden that was happening to the businesses, everybody's starting to assume that that's going forward to be their regular new course of operation. Your scenario doesn't necessarily apply to that because you're giving them something that they were getting to get a break cut. Whether they were using a parking lot which arguably isn't usable because it's part of the site plan. And to the renewal, we were trying to take the tack that the renewal was on the base license in the original conveyance.
Yeah.
It wasn't how it got to because there were special circumstances.
Well, and that's what I'm saying is you look back to the original license and then what the renewal request was for. With respect to the premise increase, I think that that's a little easier to deal with because there were special rules that were given, the special permission authority given to local licensing authorities to just approve those without ABCC sign off. Now, what has happened though is if the licensed establishments want to continue down that path, they now have to go to the ABCC for that. The one time or two time, whatever it was, approval that was given to you guys is no longer, if they want to make that a regular part of their business, they have to make those a part of the licensed premises, and they have to get approval from the ABCC, like they used to have to for outdoor entertainment.
But
or outdoor.
we as a board have to be awfully careful on the front end when we first issue a license to somebody because our mindset had been, well, if this proves that they can't do this properly, then we'll pull it back. There seems to be a lot more burden to doing that. If you grant a license that has these conditions, pulling them back without a voluminous backup, it would be arbitrary.
You got to have a hearing on it at that point, right? And you know, pulling it back, with my example, the acoustic versus the 5-piece heavy metal band. I mean, you end up pulling it back because of noise, for complaints. But yeah, you got to build that record. I've had, you know, the chief comes in and he said, I've had 57 complaints over the course of 63 days. I mean, I think at that point,
say,
modify.
don't worry about it because we'll catch that on the renewal and we'll just deny. There has to be more than that.
Yeah, I think at some point you would have to, and even with that kind of renewal and you're going to modify, you would have to bring them in and allow them to have notice and opportunity to be heard on that renewal.
Okay.
Thank you, Don. All right, Julie, just to kind of wrap up, is there any closing comments?
No, I don't have anything to say.
Larry?
I know that's shocking.
I have nothing.
Larry, anything?
I do not.
Mary, any closing remarks?
Just that I'd like it to be clear that our goal is to be fair to all of the businesses and yet fair to the residents that live near the businesses. And my hope is whatever we do to adjust this helps us achieve that. People get what they need to do, they do it, and we aren't having a lot of hearings. That's my goal.
Don?
I'm good.
Joe?
Really to build off of what Board Member Anderson just said, I think it's appropriate to note that this was a non-prime time meeting of the Board of Selectmen, and I hope folks that are either already that are hearing this and watching this either on GoToMeeting or the broadcast on Channel 18 when that happens, if it's not already happening, take note of that. This is an unusual time for the Board of Selectmen to meet. Everyone here presenting to the board is literally being paid to be here, but the board members took time out of your daily schedules. And that goes back to what I said at the top of the workshop, the board's dedication to these matters, and I think to convey to the public how serious we take these matters, and certainly the board as a local licensing authority takes these matters. And I think this was a very helpful discussion. I know as much as I hoped to offer, I learned as much, if not more, from hearing you folks as authority members. And I think the tasks that Attorney Blake, Chief Gilmet, and I have, along with Ms. Delaney, to get substantive things back to you will bear fruit, as Selectman Anderson was saying. So I think this was a very positive and helpful workshop for me, and I'm sure others on staff would say the same thing. So thank you for taking time out of your daily lives to do something out of the ordinary, because this is so important to the town.
Chief?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, I agree 100% with the town administrator. Thank you all for taking time out and for allowing the police department input on this process, and providing, you know, all of us sitting here provides much better clarification for me that I can pass down to our officers. We're gonna continue to train on these regulations and refine things and refine the process, hopefully, and it will just have, everybody will have a small piece and nobody having a gigantic piece. And with that being said, I think it was an excellent use of our time today, but again, I appreciate your support and providing the PD the input in this.
Thank you, Chief. Attorney Blake?
Real briefly, you know, I echo what the administrator and the chief have just said. I think it was very constructive. I'm happy to hear some of your concerns, because as I said when we first started this, from a legal basis, you know, I think these regulations are strong, but hearing some of your questions, hearing some of your comments, and hearing some of your thoughts on it, particularly the district. That's something that I think you had mentioned that before, but I kind of forgotten about it. You know, the town is a separate, in each district or each village is separate and distinct, and that might be a very good idea. I also think that it's you guys are in a real hard spot. You are balancing businesses and people's livelihoods with quality of life for residents. And, you know, I think that I'm glad that you all recognize this, and it's on the forefront from speaking with you as a whole and from speaking with at least you, the chair, individually. You fully recognize that, and I think you're coming from a good place.
Thank you. Chief, I didn't mean to jump over the indoor not exceeding. So if you have recommendations on cleanup, I would just have the conversation with Attorney Blake and make that part of what Joe's gonna bring back globally to the board.
Sure.
Thank you for attending and your input. Obviously, your memo went a long way. We've had 2 or 3 meetings on it since you read it. Thank the Deputy Chief for sitting and listening and taking time out of your day, and Attorney Blake for coming, and Danielle for being here and taking great notes. I would call on you, Danielle, but you probably yell at me later. I don't know if you have anything to say, but.
I don't, but thank you.
Okay. So I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. We'll do a roll call. Don?
Aye.
Mary?
Aye.
Larry?
Aye.
Julie?
Aye.
And I'm an aye.